and welcome to another Grimm fairy tale. Now today we're going to be discussing The Maiden Without Hands. Now this has many different titles like The Girl Without Hands, The Helpless Maiden. There's lots of different titles for this fairy tale. And it's a fairy tale that was collected by the Brothers Grimm for their first publication of the Children's and Household Tales in the year 1812. Now this particular fairy tale, as with a lot of the other ones, had to go through various revisions through the years. Now the original tale to this was one that was written by Giambattista Basile and included in Il Pentamerone, which is the Tale of Tales, in 16 something. And that is so screwed up and not for children, absolutely not. It is so screwed up and has so many adult themes that when the Grimms got hold of it, they changed it, which they had to do, because it wouldn't have been acceptable for those themes to be in the Victorian society, which is where they were before the Victorian society, because she didn't come to a throne till a bit later on. But around, you think about that sort of morals and things and religious connotations, the original that Basile published would not be accepted. So it had to change. Now that original that was so screwed up, I'm only going to allude to because that is not in this video. I've placed a bid on that book. I'm waiting for it to come through, but I will allude to the things that I know are different and the things that might be when we're going through this. Now this fairy tale has a similar appeal to the likes of other famous fairy tales, such as Snow White and Cinderella, even though Cinderella wasn't written by the Grimms. Cinderella was from Charles Perrault in France. The Grimms did their own version, which is Fairy Pelts. There's a lot of interconnections in fairy tales, but we'll get there eventually. But like with those original tales, which Disney then changed to be for a more pleasant and very children-focused audience, I can see why Disney didn't pick this one up. Although they could if they changed it like they changed Snow White or Sleeping Beauty for that matter. Because those originals are just unhinged. But in The Maiden Without Hands by the Brothers Grimm, we begin with a miller who was very poor and had nothing but his mill and a large apple tree which stood behind it, his wife and his daughter. That was all he had. No money, no coins to rub together. And on his journey into the forest to collect wood, he came across an old man. There's just random old men just dotted about the forest. And this old man asked the miller why he was torturing himself so much, what was wrong with him. And he made him an offer that if the miller would give the old man what was behind his mill, then he would make the miller rich, and in 3 years' time he would come to collect on the debt. Now the miller didn't see anything wrong with this agreement, and he agreed straight away, as what was behind his mill was only the apple tree, and he could forgo apples if he could get rich, because then he could buy his own. And he signed the agreement. Now in most fairy tales, there is no agreement. There is no, sign on the dotted line. There's none of that. This time there was. Now when the miller returned home, he was confronted instantly by his wife, who wanted an answer as to why their coffers, which were empty and home to spiders, were now brimming and overflowing with gold. And the miller happily told her he had promised this old man in the woods that he could have what was behind the mill in exchange for all these riches. And his wife threw up her hands and exclaimed that he was so stupid for agreeing to that, and not only agreeing to it, but signing a contract agreeing to that. Because the old man must have been the devil, and he hadn't meant the apple tree, but their only daughter, who that afternoon had been sweeping the yard behind the mill in front of the apple tree. Now the miller's daughter was beautiful and pious, because aren't they always? And when 3 years had passed, the devil showed up and wanted to take her away with him. Now, speaking from a modern sort of book talk era, if the devil showed up and wanted to fetch you away with him, I think most people would go. But the maiden was very, very clever, and she drew a circle around herself and purified herself with water. Now, because of this, the devil couldn't get to her, and he turned angrily to the miller and said to him that he wanted the miller to take all the water away from his daughter so she couldn't purify herself, and so he could grab her and take her away, because then he would have power over her. And since the miller was deathly afraid of the devil, he agreed. Now, the next morning, the devil appeared again, but the maiden kept inside her circle, and she wept so much that her tears purified her, so that she was completely clean. Although how she could, I'm not even going to get it into the logistics. Now once more the devil couldn't get near her, and he furiously turned to the miller and told the miller to chop off both of her hands so she couldn't use them to wash herself, and so he could grab her. Now the miller was horrified and retorted that he was her father. She was his only daughter. How could he even contemplate chopping off the hands of his only daughter? And he said that he wouldn't do it. Now the devil turned to him and said, "If I can't take her, I'm taking you." And the miller was so scared at this that he promised to do what the devil had asked. And he went to his daughter and explained to her that if he didn't chop off her hands, then the devil would take him instead. And because he was in fear of the devil, he had agreed to do it. Father of the Year right there. Now the girl just simply looked at her father and said, "You are my father, I must do as you bid me." And that he could do it. And she extended her arms out, and the miller took an axe, sharpened it, and chopped off both of her hands. Now the devil turned up the third morning, but because the maiden had wept so long over her stumps, that they were now clean as well. And because of this, because the devil had tried 3 times to try and take her away and been thwarted each time, he lost any claim he had on her and had to leave without her. Now in the original, which I alluded to, the devil doesn't even come into it. The girl chops off her own hands so as to stop either her father's or her brother's incestuous advances towards her, so that she is no longer beautiful, she is spoiled, so they won't touch her. That's part of the original, which of course they had to change. But getting back to ours, now that the threat of the devil taking his daughter was gone, and the miller had amassed all this wealth because of his daughter, he promised her that he would see to it that she lived in splendour for the rest of her life, that she would want for nothing. But his daughter did not want to remain there. I mean, can you really blame her? Her father's just chopped her hands off for making an agreement with the devil and not wanting to go himself. So she told him that she wanted to leave, and she didn't want to take any of his money. She would rather depend on the kindness of others that she met along the way. In other words, you can stick your gold where the sun don't shine, I want absolutely nothing to do with you. And she had her maimed hands bound to her back, because, I mean, can you even imagine? And at dawn the next day, she set out on her way. And she walked until it became dark, and she came upon a hedge that ran around the edge of the king of that country's garden. Now, there was a hole in the hedge, so she went through and she found a apple tree laden with apples just ready to eat. And she shook the tree with her body so the apples would fall down, and she picked them up with her teeth and ate them. And that is how she lived for 2 days, until she was discovered by the king's guards and caught for stealing. So they picked her up, they seized her, and they threw her into the prison for theft. And the next day she was dragged before the king and his court for sentencing and to be expelled from the country for stealing the king's apples. I mean, she just doesn't catch a break, this lass. Now, the king's son, the prince, had a kinder heart than his father and took pity on the poor girl. I mean, she's got no hands and she's got them tied to her back, so they've got to, whiff a bit. But he said that it would be better if they put her to work feeding the chickens in the courtyard. And the king agreed because, a bit of leniency never goes wrong. And so the maiden stayed at the castle for some time and she fed the chickens in the courtyard. Now the prince saw her often and he spoke to her quite a lot. And after a time he became very fond of her. However, the time came when the prince came of age and he had to marry. And multiple royal messengers were sent out from the kingdom to find him a beautiful bride to marry. Now the prince went to his father and said, "Why, you don't have to spend all this money sending out all these royal messengers, because I know somebody that I want to marry right here in this kingdom, right here in this court, right here in this castle." Now the old king tried to think of who his son might mean, but he could think of nobody who was rich and beautiful that he didn't already know or hadn't already turned down. And he suddenly turned to his son and said, you don't mean that lass that has no hands and is feeding the chickens in the courtyard. She's a servant." But the prince explained to him that he would marry nobody else but her. And finally the king yielded to his son's wishes because really, what was it harming? And soon after saying, "Yes, you can marry this girl," he died, which is a bit convenient, don't you think? And the prince married the maiden, inherited the throne, and lived happy for quite some time. But the time came when the new young king had to leave his kingdom and go to war. It was during his absence while he was at war that the queen gave birth to a beautiful child. And she sent a messenger to the king while he was at war, telling him of his beautiful child that had just been born. However, on the journey, the messenger decided to stop by a wonderful, relaxing, babbling brook and go to sleep. Now, while the messenger was asleep, the devil appeared from the trees. Now, he still wanted revenge on the maiden for escaping him a few years earlier and thwarting his, the miller got all this wealth and he didn't even get the girl. And he exchanged the letter the messenger had telling the king of his beautiful child which had been born to his loving queen. And he exchanged it for a letter that said that the queen was not loving and that she had just given birth to a changeling. Now, when the king received this letter, he was greatly distressed. But he wrote a letter back that said nobody was to do anything until he returned. The queen and her child were to be given the utmost respect as his wife and queen of the kingdom. Leave her alone until I get back. The messenger started back with a letter, but he came upon the same babbling brook as before, sat down to rest and fell asleep again. Now once again the devil came out and he swapped over the king's letter saying that the queen and her child were to be protected until his return for a letter saying that the queen and her child were to be banished from the castle, banished from court and banished from the land on pain of death. And this was to be done even if the whole court sided with her and wept in sadness and wanted to save her. There was no saving. Those who tried to save her would be instantly put to death. Now the letter arrived and the queen was told this news. She was taken by the guards and she said that she didn't come to this kingdom to become the queen. She didn't have any luck in her life anyway, and she didn't demand any special treatment. She just requested that her child and her hands, I mean, it's been years since this point, those things have got to be decomposing. Why did she still have them? But she requested that her child and her hands be tied to her back and she would banish herself from the country. She would set out on her own. She didn't need an escort to make sure she went. Now when evening came, she'd been trekking through the forest and she came upon this magnificent stone fountain just slap bang in the middle of a clearing. And sitting next to this fountain was an old man. Swear old men in woods. And she asked him for some mercy and if he could help her, if he would untie the child on her back and bring it round to her front so that she could feed him. Now the man did as she asked because this old man was not the devil, he was a good guy. And he brought the child round and she started feeding him. And as he was doing this and as he was talking to her, he pointed to a very large tree at the end of the fountain with a very, very large trunk. And he instructed the maiden that she should go over there and wrap her arms around this tree as much as she can, as far as she could. Now when the maiden did this, she went to the tree, she wrapped her arms around it as far as she could. Her hands grew back, attached to her, and as good as new. They disappeared from her back and grew back on her arms. Dumbfounded, the maiden turned to the old man, who then said, "You've got to go to this cottage in this clearing just over there, and you have to go live in it. You can't stray from it." She was not to leave the house, and she wasn't even to open the door unless somebody asked to come in 3 times for God's sake. Now, in the meantime, while all this was going on, the war had been won and the young king returned to his castle. He got hold of the letters that had eventually turned up, and he realised how he had been deceived, or somebody had been deceived. And he killed the messenger, because, I mean, he shouldn't have been sleeping on the job anyway. Killed the messenger, and he set out to look for his queen and his child, with only one servant to accompany him in this journey. Why he didn't take the whole lot, never mind. Now, after days and days of journeying, the king and the servant lost their way in the forest at night, and it happened to be the same forest in which the cottage stood. So the servant saw the flickering light from the cottage window and pointed it out and said, "We should go rest over there in that cottage. We should go ask them, for help." Now, the young king wanted to decline because he didn't want to rest until he had found his wife and his son, presumably. But the servant badgered him, cajoled him, and complained so much that he was tired and exhausted, that the king finally agreed, and so they went to this cottage. Now, when they arrived at this cottage, they saw the queen in the window because of the moonlight shining down into the clearing, and the servant pointed out that it looked a lot like the queen that they were searching for, except that it couldn't be her because this particular person in this particular window had hands. Why her husband didn't recognise her, it's only been like a few days, but now the servant went up to the door and knocked on it and said, may we have lodging for the night? And she refused. She wouldn't open the door, she wouldn't talk to him, and she just said no, because of course he didn't ask for God's sake. And so the servant just wanted to move on and find somewhere else to lodge for the night because they clearly weren't getting in here. But the king himself stepped forward and said, "For God's sake, let me enter." And the maiden replied that she couldn't let him in, she couldn't even open the door, until he had asked twice more for God's sake. And after the king had asked another 2 times, she threw open the door and the king entered. Now, no sooner had the king gone across the threshold than a little boy came skipping towards them. I mean, how long have they been there? I thought the kid was a baby. If it's been years, then what the... But his son came skipping towards him, and the king recognised him immediately. And the queen was standing behind the child, and he recognised her immediately. How he didn't recognise her from the window, or from her voice, is probably a little bit dense. It's probably a good job he's pretty. But they had a grand reunion night, and the next morning they all set out from this cottage on the way back to their kingdom. And no sooner as they all vacated the cottage, than it vanished behind them. And that is where we leave our tale, with the king, his queen, his son, and his servant returning back to the kingdom that they've left for presumably years because the child was a baby when she got chucked out and banished, and is now able to walk and skip. So if you like this fairy tale, please comment that down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and as always, keep reading.
The moonlight's soft embrace, dark star sips with calm and grace. Wine flows like whispers, secrets told, in the night where dreams unfold. Lonely shadows dance with glee, eyes of amber, soul set free. Finds they weave a tale so grand, woven by a whispering hand. Sip the wine, embrace the night, dark stars journey shining bright. Through the trials, through the pain, love and shall still ring